In the previous part, we saw Elliot Vaughn convinced that he had won. The papers were signed, the marriage was over, and Marianne walked away in silence. But stories like this don't end with signatures. The real game began the very next morning. A morning when Elliot Vaughn felt, for the first time, that power isn't taken in a single moment. It fades slowly. And today's story begins right there, at the point where a powerful man starts losing his grip, while a quiet woman takes control of everything.
The next morning arrived without mercy for Elliot Vaughn. Sunlight filled the penthouse, but it did nothing to lift the weight pressing against his chest. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, numbers and clauses replayed in his mind, each one confirming the same truth: he was no longer in control. For the first time in years, Elliot woke up without a clear advantage. He dressed carefully, slower than usual. At the office, the atmosphere had shifted again. It wasn't just caution now, it was distance. Employees greeted him politely, but the warmth was gone. Doors closed more quickly. Conversations ended when he approached. Elliot noticed every detail, and each one felt like a quiet reminder that authority, once cracked, was never the same again. During a scheduled executive briefing, Elliot attempted to lead as he always had. He spoke with confidence, issued directives, and outlined aggressive strategies. But midway through his presentation, he was interrupted, politely but firmly. A board representative reminded him that certain initiatives now required additional approval. The room went silent. Elliot forced a nod, masking the humiliation behind a practiced smile. Inside, something twisted painfully. This was not how power was supposed to fade. It wasn't dramatic or explosive. It dissolved slowly in front of witnesses, one interruption at a time. After the meeting, Elliot retreated to his office and closed the door. He stared at his reflection in the glass, searching for the man who had once dominated every room. That man was still there, but diminished, restrained by rules he no longer controlled. Across the city, Marianne reviewed the same meeting notes from a different perspective. She noted Elliot's resistance, his refusal to adapt. She expected it. People like Elliot didn't bend easily, they broke instead. Calmly, she forwarded instructions to the board, nothing drastic, just subtle adjustments that tightened the boundaries a little more. Marianne understood something Elliot still refused to accept. Power was not about volume. It was about positioning. And Elliot was standing in the wrong place. By midday, Elliot Vaughn's frustration had hardened into something colder and more dangerous. It was no longer confusion or disbelief, it was calculation. He sat behind his desk, fingers steepled, eyes fixed on the city below, forcing his mind into the mode that had built his empire in the first place. Panic was useless, emotion was weakness. If Marianne thought she could corner him quietly, she had underestimated how relentless he could be when threatened. He began making calls. Old allies, former board members, investors who owed him favors. Elliot spoke carefully, never revealing the full picture, framing the situation as a temporary misunderstanding caused by outdated paperwork. Some listened, some hesitated, a few promised to look into it, but too many conversations ended with polite deflections and vague assurances. The influence he once wielded effortlessly now required persuasion. That realization unsettled him. Elliot opened a private file on his computer one he hadn't accessed in years. Inside were records of confidential decisions, aggressive acquisitions, and compromises that had lived safely in the shadows while he held power. He had always believed these were leverage, insurance against betrayal. Now he wondered how much of it Marianne already knew. The thought made his jaw tighten. Meanwhile, across town, Marianne sat in another quiet meeting, listening as legal advisors walked her through projected outcomes. She absorbed every detail without interruption, her expression steady. Elliot's outreach efforts had already been flagged, his calls logged, his strategies anticipated. None of it surprised her. When the meeting ended, Marianne remained seated for a moment, staring at the empty chair across from her. She didn't feel satisfaction yet. This stage wasn't about victory, it was about exposure. Elliot needed room to move, room to believe he still had options. Only then would he reveal how narrow his path had become. Back in his office, Elliot leaned back and exhaled slowly. He convinced himself this was still a battle he could win. He told himself Marianne was playing a dangerous game she wouldn't finish. Confidence returned, thin but present, wrapped tightly around his pride. What Elliot didn't see was how carefully the walls were closing in. Every call he made, every move he planned, every step he took, all of it was already accounted for. As the days passed, the pressure on Elliot Vaughn intensified in ways he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't loud or dramatic, it was systematic, methodical, and deeply personal. Invitations to exclusive events stopped arriving. Private dinners he once headlined quietly removed his name from guest lists. Even social circles that had once revolved around his presence began to orbit elsewhere. Elliot noticed everything. At a charity gala he insisted on attending, conversations shifted the moment he approached. Smiles became polite but distant. Compliments were replaced with cautious nods. For the first time, Elliot experienced what it felt like to be tolerated rather than admired. The realization gnawed at him more aggressively than any financial setback. He confronted one of his longtime associates later that night, demanding honesty. The man hesitated before finally admitting that people were unsure where Elliot stood anymore. Power, he explained gently, attracted loyalty, but uncertainty attracted silence. The words cut deeper than Elliot expected. Determined to regain control of the narrative, Elliot contacted a media consultant the following morning. He planned a public rebrand, interviews that framed him as a visionary navigating strategic transitions. He believed perception could still save him. Influence, after all, was built on stories people chose to believe. What he didn't realize was that Marian had already rewritten the story. From her office, Marian monitored every public move Elliot attempted to make. She didn't interfere directly, she didn't block him. Instead, she allowed his efforts to unfold while quietly releasing verified data through official channels, financial filings, governance updates, compliance reports. Facts replaced rumors, transparency replaced spin. Each document reduced Elliot's image just a little more. Late one evening, Elliot sat alone again, scrolling through articles that mentioned his name with unfamiliar restraint. The language was neutral, cautious, stripped of praise. He wasn't celebrated, he was described. To a man who lived on admiration, it felt like erasure. Across the city, Marian closed her laptop and stood by the window of her apartment. She watched the lights flicker across the skyline, her reflection calm and untroubled. She understood something Elliot was only beginning to grasp. Control didn't disappear overnight. It faded in public first. And Elliot Vaughn was fading fast. Elliot Vaughn began to understand that time was no longer neutral. Each day that passed without resolution worked against him, reshaping opinions and solidifying assumptions he could no longer control. The silence from certain corners of his world felt deliberate now, not accidental. People were waiting for clarity, they were adjusting to a new reality. He decided to confront the problem directly. Elliot requested a private meeting with the board, expecting resistance but prepared to assert himself. The meeting was scheduled quickly, which he took as a positive sign. When he entered the room, he noticed immediately where he was seated, not at the head of the table, but along the side. A small detail, yet impossible to ignore. As discussions began, Elliot spoke confidently, outlining his vision, reminding them of past successes, emphasizing his role in building the company. He expected agreement or at least acknowledgement. Instead, the responses were measured, analytical, and detached. The board listened, but they did not follow. When the chairperson finally spoke, the message was clear. Stability mattered more than personality. Governance mattered more than history, and authority now flowed through structure, not ego. Elliot nodded outwardly, but inside something fractured. He realized then that this wasn't a misunderstanding to be corrected. It was a transition already underway. After the meeting, Elliot lingered in the hallway, watching board members leave without lingering conversations or reassurances. No one stopped to talk, no one offered support. The absence felt intentional, as if a boundary had quietly been drawn. At the same time, Marian reviewed the meeting summary from a secure dashboard. She noted Elliot's tone, his resistance, his reliance on past achievements. None of it concerned her. The board's language had shifted exactly as anticipated, less emotional, more procedural. That shift meant permanence. Marian closed the file and made a single note for herself. Elliot was still fighting the past. She was already managing the future. And the distance between those two positions was growing wider every day. Elliot Vaughn left the boardroom with a controlled expression, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. He walked the long corridor alone, past framed photos of company milestones that once felt like personal trophies. Each image now looked like evidence from a life that was quietly being revised without his consent. The company still bore his fingerprints, but ownership of the story was slipping away. Back in his office, Elliot closed the door and sat down slowly. He opened his calendar and stared at the empty spaces where meetings had once filled every hour. Cancellations weren't announced anymore, they simply appeared. The absence of urgency from others told him everything he needed to know. He was no longer the axis around which decisions revolved. He considered drastic measures. Legal action, public confrontation, a forced narrative that painted him as wronged, but each option came with risks he could no longer absorb easily. Power had once protected him from consequences. Now consequences seemed to be waiting patiently for him to choose poorly. Elliot's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from someone he hadn't heard from in months. It wasn't supportive. It wasn't hostile either. It was cautious, carefully worded, and non-committal. Even allies were choosing distance over loyalty. Across town, Marian reviewed operational reports while sipping coffee, her movements unhurried. She approved small adjustments, nothing dramatic, nothing emotional. She understood that true control didn't announce itself, it normalized. It became routine until no one remembered it had ever been different. She paused briefly, reflecting on how predictably Elliot was responding. The anger, the resistance, the instinct to dominate rather than adapt. It was the same pattern that had once made him powerful and the same one now making him fragile. Marian saved her notes and closed the file. Elliot still believed this was a battle of authority. She knew it was a lesson in limits. And the lesson was far from over. The following morning arrived without ceremony, but for Elliot Vaughn it felt like the air itself had changed. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, staring down at the city that once mirrored his dominance. Atlanta still moved fast, still glittered with ambition, yet for the first time he sensed that it no longer moved asterisk for asterisk him. The silence in the room was heavier than any argument he had ever lost. He dressed carefully, choosing a suit that once guaranteed instant respect. As he adjusted his cufflinks, he noticed his hands trembling slightly. The detail enraged him. Weakness, even physical, was something he despised. He told himself this was temporary, a momentary imbalance that he would correct soon, just like every other crisis before it. At headquarters, the atmosphere confirmed his fear. Conversations stopped when he entered. People smiled too quickly, nodded too politely. It was the kind of courtesy reserved for someone whose authority was already being discussed in private. Elliot walked past them anyway, chin high, refusing to acknowledge the shift. During an executive briefing, he spoke more than necessary, asserting ideas no one challenged aloud, but he noticed what wasn't said. No follow-up questions, no enthusiasm, no urgency to execute his vision. It was as if his words were being recorded, not acted upon. Across the city, Marian attended a smaller meeting in a quiet conference room. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic gestures. She listened more than she spoke, letting others present information, then asked precise questions that revealed gaps Elliot had always ignored. Each answer strengthened her position without her needing to claim it openly. When the meeting ended, one executive lingered. He asked carefully where things were heading. Marian met his eyes and replied calmly that stability mattered more than personalities. The man nodded, relieved. That was all he needed to hear. By evening, Elliot received confirmation that a major partnership review had been postponed indefinitely, without consulting him. The message was brief, professional, and devastating. He sat alone in his office long after everyone had left, staring at the city lights again. For the first time, Elliot understood something he had never considered before. Power didn't disappear with noise. It vanished quietly while he was still talking. And somewhere in that silence, Marian was already preparing the next move. The pressure finally began to manifest in ways Elliot Vaughn could no longer ignore. By midweek, the familiar rhythm of control had collapsed into a series of unpredictable interruptions. His assistant hesitated before entering his office now, choosing words carefully, as if every sentence needed approval before being spoken. That hesitation irritated him more than open defiance ever could. A legal memorandum arrived just before noon. Elliot skimmed it once, then again, slower this time. It wasn't an accusation, not yet. It was an inquiry, polite, neutral, and deliberately vague. Requests for clarification, documentation, verification of decisions made over the past 3 years, the kind of letter that didn't threaten but warned. He slammed the file shut, anger tightening his jaw. He made several calls that afternoon, old contacts, familiar voices that once answered immediately. Some didn't pick up, others promised to circle back. Each delay felt like another door closing, another reminder that influence had an expiration date he had ignored for too long. Meanwhile, Marian sat in her office reviewing archival contracts late into the evening. She worked methodically, cross-referencing timelines, identifying structural weaknesses that had been hidden beneath Elliot's aggressive expansion strategy. She didn't rush, she didn't need to. The pieces were already moving, her role was simply to ensure they aligned. At one point, she paused and looked out her own window, not at the city, but at the reflection staring back at her. Calm, focused, untouched by panic, she understood something Elliot never had: authority rooted in preparation outlasted authority built on intimidation. The next morning, a confidential audit was announced internally. No names mentioned, no blame assigned, just a process described as routine. Elliot read the notice 3 times, his pulse accelerating with each word. Routine processes had never concerned him before, now they felt surgical. In a quiet hallway, 2 executives exchanged a glance as Elliot passed. It wasn't hostile, it wasn't sympathetic either, it was resigned, as if an outcome had already been accepted. Elliot returned to his office and closed the door, breathing heavily. For the first time, he wondered whether fighting harder was only accelerating the fall, but stepping back felt impossible. He had built his identity on forward motion. Marian, receiving updates in real time, allowed herself a single controlled breath. The system was doing exactly what it was designed to do. And Elliot, trapped inside it, was finally beginning to understand that no amount of force could reverse a structure he no longer commanded. The balance had shifted, and this time it wasn't shifting back. By the end of that week, Elliot Vaughn felt as though he were living inside a narrowing corridor. Every step forward required more effort, and every attempt to turn around revealed doors that no longer opened. The office that once amplified his presence now felt sterile, stripped of the energy that had fed his confidence. Even the silence had changed, it no longer waited for him to speak. He requested a private meeting with the board, framing it as a strategic alignment discussion. The response came hours later, short and impersonal. The meeting would be scheduled, no urgency, no confirmation of attendance. Elliot read the message twice, then a third time, searching for tone between the lines. There was none, only distance. That night he met with an external consultant he trusted, someone known for navigating corporate crises discreetly. They spoke behind closed doors in a quiet restaurant far from the usual business districts. Elliot laid out his concerns bluntly, expecting reassurance or at least tactical advice. Instead, the consultant listened, then asked a single question that landed heavier than any accusation. Do you still control the narrative? Elliot didn't answer immediately. Across the city, Marian reviewed a preliminary audit summary delivered securely to her tablet. The findings were careful, restrained, but unmistakable. Patterns, oversights, decisions made without sufficient documentation. Nothing illegal on its own, yet together they formed a picture of recklessness. She forwarded the summary to legal with a brief note requesting procedural next steps. She wasn't interested in spectacle, she was interested in closure. The following morning, an internal memo circulated announcing temporary restructuring measures. Authority was redistributed, committees were formed, oversight increased. Elliot's name appeared, but not where it once dominated. He stared at the screen, feeling something inside him fracture, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet finality. In the hallway outside his office, a younger executive paused and nodded respectfully, then continued walking without waiting for acknowledgement. That small moment hurt more than any formal demotion could have. Elliot closed his door and sat down, hands folded, breathing slowly. For years, he had mistaken motion for control and volume for leadership. Now, surrounded by stillness, he realized how little foundation he had actually built. Marian received confirmation that the board had accepted the initial recommendations without objection. She set her tablet down and looked ahead, already planning the transition phase. There was no triumph in her expression, only resolve. Because this was never about winning. It was about ending something that should have ended long ago. And Elliot, whether he was ready or not, was approaching that end. The formal notice arrived on a quiet Monday morning, delivered with professional politeness that felt sharper than open hostility. Elliot Vaughn read the subject line twice before. Opening the document, already sensing what it contained, it was an invitation, no, a summons to attend a special board session scheduled for the end of the week. The agenda was brief: governance review, executive accountability, future leadership alignment. Each phrase was neutral, yet together they formed a verdict waiting to be spoken aloud. He sat motionless for several minutes after finishing the email. In the past, board meetings had been performances he controlled, stages where he dazzled with numbers, confidence, and selective truths. This one felt different. This one felt like an examination. And for the first time in his career, Elliot wasn't sure he had the answers prepared. As the days passed, subtle changes continued to surface. His calendar was adjusted without consultation. His access to certain internal reports required secondary approval. Even his assistant began copying another executive on routine correspondence. None of it was dramatic, but all of it was deliberate. Authority was being redistributed piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do without making himself look desperate. Marian observed these shifts from a distance, never interfering directly. She understood the psychology of collapse better than most. When power is stripped suddenly, it invites chaos. When it is eased away gradually, it invites acceptance. Elliot was being guided toward inevitability, whether he recognized it or not. During a late afternoon walk through the city, Elliot found himself pausing at a cafe he used to frequent years ago, before titles and influence had hardened his edges. He watched people move past the windows, young professionals, students, strangers with no idea who he was or what he had built. For a fleeting moment, he wondered who he might have been if ambition hadn't consumed every choice. That thought unsettled him more than the board meeting ever could. On the morning of the session, Marian reviewed final briefing materials with legal counsel. Every point was substantiated, every conclusion defensible. There was no malice in the process, no personal commentary, only structure correcting itself. She closed the folder and exhaled slowly, aware that what came next would redefine more than one career. Elliot entered the boardroom precisely on time. The familiar faces greeted him with reserved nods, their expressions unreadable. As he took his seat, he felt a strange calm settle over him, the kind that comes when resistance finally gives way to reality. The meeting began without ceremony. And with its first question, Elliot understood that this was no longer a negotiation. It was a transition. One that would leave him on the other side of the power he once believed was permanent. The boardroom felt colder than usual, though Elliot Vaughn knew it wasn't the temperature. It was the absence of deference that unsettled him most. No one rushed to pour coffee. No one asked how his weekend had been. The meeting moved forward with procedural precision, as if he were already a peripheral figure rather than the man who had once dominated the space with ease. The chairperson spoke first, outlining the purpose of the session in a calm, even tone. There was no accusation in the language, only structure, governance standards, fiduciary responsibility, long-term stability. Elliot listened, nodding occasionally, but each word landed like a measured step away from him. When questions came, they were specific, informed, and impossible to deflect with charisma alone. He answered carefully at first, choosing phrases that had protected him in the past. Strategic discretion, competitive necessity, market pressure. But the follow-ups were relentless: dates, approvals, documentation. The room was no longer interested in his intent, only in the trail he had left behind. For the first time, Elliot felt the weakness of decisions made on instinct rather than record. Across the table, Marian spoke only when asked. Her contributions were brief, factual, and devastatingly clear. She didn't raise her voice or challenge Elliot directly. She simply filled in the spaces his explanations left empty. Each time she spoke, the room seemed to lean toward her without realizing it. As the discussion deepened, Elliot noticed something else that disturbed him even more than the questions. No one looked surprised, not by the findings, not by the conclusions forming in the air. This meeting wasn't about discovery, it was about confirmation. Decisions had already been weighed. Today was about process, not persuasion. A short recess was called. Elliot stepped into the hallway alone, loosening his tie as if it were restricting his breathing. He stared at his reflection in the glass wall, barely recognizing the man looking back. The confidence was still there, but it floated now, untethered from authority. Inside the boardroom, Marian reviewed her notes one final time. She felt no satisfaction, only responsibility. The system had reached the point where correction was no longer optional. What followed would be difficult but necessary. When the members reconvened, the chairperson cleared their throat and spoke with quiet finality. The words were formal, restrained, and irreversible. A transition plan would be enacted. Elliot's role would change, effective immediately. Elliot remained seated, absorbing the moment in silence. This wasn't defeat in the way he had imagined. It was something colder, an ending without drama. And as the meeting adjourned, he understood that the world he had ruled hadn't collapsed. It had simply moved on without him. Elliot Vaughn left the boardroom last, his footsteps echoing faintly in the corridor as the doors closed behind him. No one followed, no one stopped him. The absence of confrontation felt heavier than any argument ever could. He adjusted his jacket out of habit, then realized there was no audience left to impress. Back in his office, he stood for a long time without turning on the lights. The city outside glowed faintly through the glass, blurred by the onset of evening. This room had once been his command center, a place where decisions rippled outward and shaped lives. Now it felt like a museum of his own past, preserved but irrelevant. He finally sat and opened a drawer he rarely touched. Inside were old notebooks, handwritten ideas from the early days when the company was still fragile and uncertain. He flipped through the pages slowly, recognizing the ambition, the hunger, the certainty that he alone knew what success should look like. That certainty had carried him far, but it had also blinded him. Across town, Marian concluded a series of quiet calls. Each conversation was brief, respectful, and forward-looking. She spoke of continuity, of trust, of restoring confidence where it had eroded. People responded positively, not because they feared her, but because they believed in the structure she represented. Late that night, Elliot received an email confirming the details of the transition. Office reassignment, reduced authority, advisory limitations. The language was neutral, almost kind. He read it once, then closed the laptop without responding. There was nothing left to argue. The next morning, staff began arriving earlier than usual, energized by a sense of change they didn't fully articulate. Meetings proceeded smoothly without Elliot's intervention. Decisions were made, progress continued. The company breathed easier, almost imperceptibly. Elliot walked through the lobby unnoticed, pausing briefly near the exit. For the first time in years, no one greeted him by name. The realization stung, but it also clarified something he had avoided acknowledging. Titles grant access, but relevance must be earned again and again. As the doors closed behind him and the city noise swallowed his presence, Elliot understood that power, once lost, does not announce its departure. It simply leaves. And whether he would rebuild himself beyond it remained an unanswered question. Elliot Vaughn spent the following days in a strange suspension between identity and reality. Without the constant pull of meetings, calls, and crises, time expanded in ways he had never learned to manage. Mornings arrived quietly, without urgency, without assistance reminding him where to be. He woke early out of habit, dressed sharply out of reflex, then stood still, unsure where to direct himself. He tried to reassert control in small ways: personal investments, private lunches with former associates, subtle inquiries framed as curiosity rather than need, but the responses were consistently polite and consistently distant. People listened, nodded, and changed the subject. Influence, he learned, did not linger out of nostalgia. One afternoon, he visited the company campus unannounced, telling himself it was harmless. The security desk verified his credentials longer than necessary before allowing him inside. As he walked the halls, he noticed how easily the organization functioned without him. Teams collaborated, managers made decisions, laughter echoed from conference rooms where his presence once suppressed it. That realization unsettled him more deeply than any formal removal. Meanwhile, Marian began implementing phase 2 of the transition culture. She met with department heads individually, not to dictate but to listen. Patterns emerged quickly, bottlenecks Elliot had dismissed, talent he had ignored, concerns that had been silenced by fear rather than inefficiency. Each conversation confirmed what she had long suspected: the system had been surviving him, not because of him. Elliot received a call from a journalist later that week, probing gently about leadership changes. He declined. Comment, his voice controlled, but the call left him rattled. Narratives were forming without his input. Stories would be told, he would not be the author. That night, alone in his apartment, Elliot poured a drink he didn't finish. He stared at his reflection in the darkened window and wondered when ambition had crossed the line into obsession, when success had stopped being a goal and become a shield. Across the city, Marian reviewed employee feedback summaries and closed her laptop with quiet satisfaction. Not pride, clarity. The organization was stabilizing faster than projected. Trust, once fractured, was beginning to repair itself. Elliot lay awake long after midnight, understanding something he had never allowed himself to consider before. Power was not taken from him in a single moment. It had been withdrawn gradually, by choice, by neglect, by arrogance. And now, for the first time, he faced a future where no title would define him. Only what he chose to become next. Weeks passed, and with them came a silence Elliot Vaughn had never known. His name no longer surfaced in industry briefings or speculative headlines. The world that once reacted to his movements now barely registered his absence. That invisibility unsettled him more than public criticism ever could have. He attempted to reinvent himself quietly. He joined advisory panels, offered mentorship, attended private networking events where his past achievements were acknowledged with polite smiles rather than awe. He spoke often of lessons learned, framing his experience as evolution rather than displacement, yet he could feel the unspoken hesitation in every room. People listened, but no one followed. During one such event, a younger entrepreneur challenged him unexpectedly, asking what he would do differently if given another chance. Elliot hesitated longer than he intended, the truth pressed against his tongue, heavy and unpolished. He finally answered with something safe, something rehearsed, but the missed honesty lingered, gnawing at him long after the conversation ended. Across the city, Marian attended a modest company gathering celebrating a successful quarter. There were no extravagant speeches, no declarations of dominance, only acknowledgement of collective effort. She stood among the employees, indistinguishable in presence yet unmistakable in influence. That was how she preferred it. Later that evening, Marian reviewed a personal note from the board commending her restraint and effectiveness during the transition. She set it aside without comment. Validation had its place, but it was not her motive. What mattered was durability, ensuring the system could outlast any individual, including herself. Elliot returned home that night with a quiet heaviness. He realized that reclaiming relevance required more than repositioning. It required humility, a currency he had never learned to value. The question was whether it was something he could still acquire. As he sat alone, city lights flickering below, Elliot acknowledged a truth he had avoided for too long. His rise had been fueled by certainty, his fall by the refusal to doubt it. Marian, preparing for the next phase of long-term strategy, paused briefly at her desk. She knew this wasn't an ending, it was a recalibration. Power, when properly distributed, didn't need a figurehead, it needed stewardship. Elliot closed his eyes and let the weight of reflection settle in. For the first time, he wasn't planning a comeback. He was questioning the cost of one. And that question, unanswered, marked the true beginning of change. The shift inside Elliot Vaughn was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. It didn't arrive as remorse or regret, but as fatigue and exhaustion rooted not in failure but in pretense. For years he had performed certainty like a role, convincing others and himself that control was permanent if defended aggressively enough. Now, without an audience, the performance felt pointless. He began declining invitations that once would have thrilled him. Industry dinners, closed-door panels, conversations built more on reputation than substance. Instead, he spent time alone, walking unfamiliar streets, sitting in cafes where no one recognized him, observing the pace of ordinary lives untouched by corporate hierarchies. There was discomfort in that anonymity, but also a strange relief. One afternoon, Elliot visited a small nonprofit incubator on the outskirts of the city, a place he had funded years earlier for tax purposes and promptly forgot. A program director recognized him and offered a tour. The organization was struggling, understaffed, underfunded, but driven by purpose rather than optics. As Elliot listened to the challenges they faced, he felt something unfamiliar stir, relevance without authority. Meanwhile, Marian entered a phase of consolidation. With the transition complete, her focus turned to sustainability, systems that corrected themselves, leadership pipelines that didn't depend on dominance, and cultures where disagreement was not punished but refined. She resisted the urge to centralize influence, knowing how easily that temptation corrupted even the most disciplined leaders. During a quarterly review, an executive asked her how she had managed to navigate the crisis without becoming a symbol herself. Marian answered simply, "By remembering I'm replaceable." The room fell quiet, not in fear, but in respect. That mindset set a tone no policy ever could. Elliot left the nonprofit that day with a stack of handwritten notes and an offer to help that didn't involve money or titles. He wasn't sure why he had made it, he only knew it felt honest. That night he wrote for the first time in years, not memos or strategies but reflections. Pages filled slowly, clumsily, as if language itself needed relearning. He didn't know where it would lead, and for once that uncertainty didn't terrify him. Marian closed her day with a final review of long-term metrics and allowed herself a moment of stillness. The organization was steady, the people were growing, that was enough. Elliot looked at his notes again before sleeping. He wasn't rebuilding power. He was rebuilding perspective. And though he didn't yet recognize it, that distinction would define everything that followed. Elliot Vaughn's days slowly began to take on a different shape, one that no longer revolved around dominance or recognition. The nonprofit incubator became a quiet anchor in his routine. He arrived early, stayed late, and listened more than he spoke. There were no assistants scheduling his time, no reporters watching his expressions. What surprised him most was how much effort it took simply to be useful without authority. He worked with small teams, helping them refine proposals, structure operations, and anticipate risks. His experience still mattered, but now it had to earn its place. When his ideas were questioned, no one deferred automatically. At first, the resistance irritated him. Then gradually it taught him restraint. He learned to explain rather than command, to persuade rather than insist. One evening, after a long session reviewing budgets, a young coordinator thanked him quietly. Not with admiration, not with flattery, just gratitude. The simplicity of it stayed with him all the way home. It was the first time in years appreciation hadn't felt transactional. Across the city, Marian faced a different challenge. Success. With stability restored, expectations grew. Stakeholders wanted acceleration, visibility, expansion. She moved carefully, aware that momentum could be as dangerous as stagnation if left unchecked. Growth without reflection, she knew, recreated the very conditions that had led to collapse before. During a leadership forum, Marian spoke openly about restraint, about resisting the urge to equate speed with progress. Some found the message uncomfortable, others found it necessary. Change, she reminded them, was not proven by how fast one moved, but by how long the structure endured. Elliot encountered an old colleague unexpectedly one afternoon. The conversation was brief, polite, and different from what he had once expected. There was no tension, no rivalry, just distance softened by time. As they parted, Elliot realized he no longer felt the need to correct the narrative of his past. It was already complete. That realization brought an unexpected calm. Marian reviewed succession planning documents late that night, making adjustments that ensured no single role would ever hold too much influence again. She understood now that her greatest contribution would be the ease with which others could follow her. Elliot returned home tired but clear-headed. He looked at his calendar for the next day, not full, not empty, but balanced. For the first time, the space didn't feel like loss. It felt like choice. And in that quiet freedom, a new chapter, unforced and unclaimed, began to take shape.
If you want to hear the next part, like the video, subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and wait just one day.